Hi, everybody. My name is Brandon Hampton with vCom, and I thought today we would talk about probably the topic or question I get the most these days is about 5G. And just people are really trying to understand it. There's a lot of fluff out there about 5G. So I thought we'd talk about 5G and some of the facts and some of the fictions associated with it. And there I am, Brandon Hampton. And the agenda today, we'll talk about the players in 5G. We'll talk about, as I said, some of those facts and fictions, what the costs look like and where we think they might go, and what the future of the technology looks like. So try to spend a little bit of time on all those things. So first of all, who are the players? Like where are we getting 5G from? And three of these are probably pretty obvious. T-Mobile, which includes Sprint now after the merger, AT&T and Verizon all have significant 5G strategies. And Dish Network is the fourth one on here. And it's interesting to note that in the government documents that were filed that were approved for the merger between T-Mobile and Sprint, the government was really concerned about lack of competition with only three players. So Dish was actually mentioned and referenced in those documents as the company that had committed to be the fourth company that were going to offer a competitive, make a competitive offering down the road. And they're currently building out a 5G network. There are some projections in that document about when they have to have so much of the population covered. I don't know if COVID has changed that or anything, but anyway, it's interesting to note that Dish over the past several years has acquired a pretty strong spectrum position, and the fact that they are starting from scratch. I heard their president speak before COVID at a conference, and he was referencing the idea that because they're building this from the ground up, it gives them some advantages that the other carriers don't have, and that they don't have a lot of legacy equipment and infrastructure to deal with out there, and they're just building it from scratch the right way the first time. So really interesting. You'll see how that offering plays out and what they're going to be able to present to the marketplace in the next couple of years. So some facts about 5G. It's really, really fast, as you can imagine. It's interesting to think where we were just 10 years ago where you were trying to get 100K on your phone, and now we're talking multi-gigabit speeds on a cell phone. It's crazy, but it is really fast. And that speed, there are a lot of factors to consider when you look at how fast can it really be, and that carriers have very different strategies, which we'll talk about. And even more important than speed, I think, and what will really impact a lot of different applications more than the speed is the low latency, extremely low latency. In fact, less latency than the majority of your network or wired connections today. And what that means is that there are a lot of applications like gaming or in healthcare with like surgery or self-driving cars, things like that really require extremely low latency to operate. And you're going to see a lot more really cool things come about because of that. And that low latency, one of the reasons that it is so low is that today, I don't know if people are aware, but when you initiate a data connection on your cell phone, let's say you hit the link on a web page, that connection is then initiated at the tower. A connection is nailed up, data is transmitted, then that connection drops. And every single time you initiate a data connection or any kind of data transfer, that happens. So that setup and teardown of every connection creates latency, a lot of it. And the reason that's the way it is today is because there are a very limited number of connections on every tower. I mean, it's in the hundreds. So you can imagine a tower in a city, thousands of people sharing this tower. You have to continually build up and tear down those connections in order for everybody to share that tower. That's how it works today. Well, with 5G, there are exponentially more connections available, and even out of the box, it's going to be in the thousands. And there's software where it can expand to a huge number of connections. And what that means is that you don't have to initiate that connection every time. All of those connections can stay nailed up. So when you go to hit your web page, you don't have to wait for it to set up that connection. It's already set up, and that data just starts flowing right away. And believe it or not, it travels over the air to a cell tower faster than it does over copper wire. So So a lot of the latency on those connections is extremely low, and that's how that can function and work. And it's important, another fact, that the carriers have different strategies on how they're deploying, how they're going to take advantage of this 5G technology, and we're going to talk about that. So some coverage facts, some ideas around the different carriers. T-Mobile has had a very different strategy, or is building this out with a very different strategy than Verizon or AT&T for sure. The spectrum that they're using, and we're going to talk more about spectrum in a minute, allows them to throw up this technology on their existing towers, and because it's a wider band spectrum than even what they're using today for their regular cell signal, it's going to even enhance their coverage and allow them to just use their current towers, put 5G on it. It's going to blow up their coverage a little bit. They're going to have great building penetration, and they can get across the country really fast. Like you can see, they have this dark purple here is all T-Mobile coverage. So very different strategy. They clearly want to own the handset market. There are some drawbacks to building it on that wide spectrum, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And then Verizon, very different strategy. They have what we call this 5G ultra wideband, and you see all those little dots on the screen in the different cities. And that's their bread and butter 5G, and they're building it at a 24 to 38 gigahertz range, which means it's very narrow band, it doesn't travel very far at all, very low building penetration, and frankly, the coverage is very limited in these cities. I mean, you're talking city blocks in those cities that have the dots up there. So that's the coverage is they're going to have serious coverage challenges, and it's going to take them a while to build out this network. And as we talk more about spectrum, we'll talk more about why that is. And then the 5G nationwide coverage, you can see that second one there. I've done some research on this, and it's hard to decide whether this is real 5G, but I suspect it's similar to what AT&T did when they deployed that 5GE network. You might remember a year or two ago, they took a bunch of heat for it because their competitors said, "Hey, that's not really 5G; it's just fancy 4G that they've enhanced." I think 5G nationwide is fancy 4G that Verizon is deploying. So I don't know that for sure. Obviously they don't tell you that. I don't want you to know that, but that would be what I would suspect. And you're probably going to see a lot more coverage with this 5G nationwide that they have. And it's really just an enhanced 4G option, would be my speculation. So if we talk about spectrum, what is spectrum? And just a real quick definition, it's just the waves that pass through the air that can transmit data. And just to give you a practical example, radio stations, like if you tune in to 94.7 on your FM channel, you're tuning in at 94.7 megahertz. And that's the spectrum band that you're using. And the radio station's got a tower that transmits that on that wave, that spectrum. And when you tune to that, assuming you're close enough to pick it up, that's what you hear. So that's what spectrum is. And the cellular companies have used various different spectrum bands over the years. And the traditional cellular with Verizon, AT&T, and T-Mobile is anywhere from 800 or 1.9 gigahertz ranges are the kind of the spectrum where most of cellular activity has happened over, since there's been cellular. Well, 5G, we're seeing a shift in that. And a lot of that shift is just due to the fact that there isn't an unlimited supply of spectrum. It is a limited supply, and there are different spectrum positions available today. And T-Mobile has built most of their 5G network on this 700 megahertz spectrum, which is a little wider than the traditional 800 that you see, which means it'll travel a little farther, give you a little better building penetration. And 1.9 gigahertz, 2.5 gigahertz, those are spectrums that they've really acquired from the Sprint merger. And they're going to be building out a lot of 5G on those spectrums as well. A lot different from AT&T and Verizon, which are using 24 to 38 gigahertz spectrum, which means that the advantages to the more narrow band spectrum is that it gives you much higher speeds. So whereas T-Mobile speeds, they're saying up to 400 megabytes per download speeds per second. Our internal testing, we've tested it in a few different cities. We're seeing anywhere from 150 to 250 megabits per second download speed. So still really fast, but not what we're going to see with AT&T and Verizon, where they're touting multi-gigabit download, so 2-3 gigabits per second download speed. So a lot faster, AT&T and Verizon for sure. The downside, though, is we've talked about because it doesn't travel very far, you've got to build a lot of facilities to fill up an area with coverage. So you think about it, where if a traditional cell tower can be a mile apart, you can have them, or more, out in the country, they can be even further apart than that, several miles even. With this, you've got to have them anywhere from 500 to 1,000 feet apart. So that means you've got to build a lot more facilities, and it's going to make it really difficult to offer coverage outside of really highly populous areas. I mean, it's just not going to make financial sense to go to a rural area and build out a 5G network for AT&T. They couldn't justify it from a cost perspective. So I really don't think you'll see that. They might have a different strategy down the road where they'll deploy 5G on different spectrum, where it'll travel farther. I don't know. But today, they're focusing on big cities where they can build a lot of facilities in a really concentrated area and provide this kind of service. The other challenge with this kind of spectrum is that it doesn't penetrate buildings at all. So if you've got, the only way to get a signal inside a building is to build facilities in the building, which the carriers are in lots of talks with a lot of commercial real estate companies to do a lot of this already, or some kind of Wi-Fi enhancement where they'll be able to use Wi-Fi in addition to 5G. But in the end, and there's also some really cool technologies where there's no building penetration, but the signal bounces off the building. So they have technology that can take all these different packets that are bouncing around in the air and compile them and reorder them and make some sense of those. So there's some cool technology like that. But in the end, they've got some challenges to really deploy a network in the 24 to 38 gigahertz range. And it's also clear that because of that strategy and the strategy T-Mobile's taking, T-Mobile's really looking to dominate the handset market, and I think they're positioned to do that with their coverage and not just in-building coverage, but the nationwide coverage that they're going to have. And AT&T and Verizon seem to be positioning themselves to compete with cable companies and be able to provide a fixed wireless connection and really provide content. And if they can do this over the air, it's going to make it tough for a company with coaxial cable to compete with them. And Dish Network, they have 600 and 700 megahertz range, which leads me to believe they'll have a similar strategy to T-Mobile, probably. Although I do think they're also going to be obviously players in the fixed wireless arena as well, given their history of providing cable services. And just from looking at the different companies and where they stand today, T-Mobile's spectrum position is really strong, especially with all the Sprint assets that they've merged with. They've got twice the spectrum that AT&T does and three times the spectrum that Verizon does today. And they're smaller, so it's kind of an interesting dynamic. Actually, not quite. I think they just passed AT&T to being the second largest. But anyway, the point is that they have a really strong spectrum position, and spectrum is not cheap. It's really expensive. When they have these spectrum auctions, these companies spend billions of dollars on this spectrum. So we'll have to see what happens with spectrum down the road as we see more government deregulation, and there's a lot of spectrum that's locked up in government that isn't even being used. And then there's new technologies coming where you're gonna be able to share spectrum across different carriers, and one band of spectrum could be 2 or 3 different carriers could be utilizing it in the future. So there will be some changes that'll make spectrum. I think it's going to open up the spectrum position down the road, but we'll see where things go. Right now, T-Mobile's got a really strong position. So what are some of the fictions? And we've really kind of already talked about a lot of the fiction. There's a lot of marketing out there today that we're seeing in 5G. I mean, you see commercials all the time with Verizon and AT&T touting their 5G networks, and in reality, the coverage is very limited for both of them, unless you're considering 5G nationwide for Verizon, which we've said is not their real 5G network. So if you want to buy a 5G handset for AT&T, and you live in a big city, you may get coverage while you're walking down the street. However, you're probably not going to get coverage in your building. And if you travel anywhere, you're probably not going to get coverage on 5G. Now, it'll fail over to 4G, but it's going to be limited. And 5G phones are not cheap either. So have at it if you want to buy a 5G phone. I'm just warning you. my recommendation would be a T-Mobile phone right now if you run a real 5G phone with some kind of coverage. So the coverage issues obviously are an issue, and Verizon's 5G, you know, the 5G nationwide, I find it interesting that I think they're doing the same thing that AT&T did a couple of years ago, and they got in trouble for it. So from a cost perspective, what are we talking about? So this is really an interesting conversation too, because these speeds are so much faster that you can imagine the opportunity to transmit a lot more data is going to be available to users. So more data is going to equal more costs. And how are the carriers going to manage this? I mean, with the plans today, T-Mobile, for example, and they probably have the best unlimited plans today with the highest throttle rates, where they don't throttle you for a while, and they've started to include 5G in those plans. But even T-Mobile has throttling. There's really no such thing as unlimited like there is on your cable internet today, where you can just use it as much as you want. That doesn't exist in mobile today. Now it might down the road. I think it may have to, but today it doesn't. So costs can get out of control, especially if you're an organization and you've got pool plans out there and you've got 5G users. You can chew up some data really fast. So that's going to be a concern. And the AT&T and Verizon plans today are around $80. T-Mobile is quite a bit less than that. So we'll see what happens with these costs. As you can imagine, with new technologies like this, they're going to try to capitalize and keep the MRCs high in the beginning, but it will come down. I think it'll come down pretty quickly as people realize the coverage isn't what you think. And T-Mobile's position is going to be really strong in the marketplace, and their costs are much lower. So I think AT&T and Verizon will eventually have to respond to that, but we'll see what happens. And then in the future, what are we looking at? So coverage will expand. It's actually grown faster than I could have imagined. I mean, I was really surprised that in the last year how much coverage AT&T and Verizon have been able to build out. So it's going to continue to expand. And that's going to mean that, you know, you're going to have more options for 5G. I think what it really means is you're going to have more fixed wireless options for AT&T and Verizon. And I think 5G as a fixed wireless option is going to really be where you're going to see a lot of shift. And I think that's where it'll really have a huge impact in the marketplace. I think you're going to see a lot of people be able to replace 5G for their cable connection that they have today, probably for less cost, and you don't have to build facilities in the new buildings and things like that anymore. And I think from a corporate perspective, from a networking perspective, 5G really is going to be where we finally have cellular as a replacement for that last mile. And we've been talking about this for years in mobile, like when will cellular be a last mile replacement? Well, I think we're finally there because there's such low latency, there's such high speed. And that means that carriers, they're going to have to release SLAs that are going to be similar, maybe even better than what you see today with certain network connections. So I think the SLA is going to be the key, but eventually in the not too distant future, I really see it being a key from a last mile replacement perspective. Government's going to continue to deregulate and change that spectrum landscape. And in the end, wireless is going to change the game. I mean, I think the days of, you know, building a building with tons of Ethernet cable and coaxial cable and all this stuff is maybe a thing of the past. I mean, I think a lot of these cellular connections, wireless connections, you're going to see really change the landscape and shift how we look at networking and how we look at you know, living our lives today from a business perspective. So that's all I have for you today. Hopefully it was short and sweet. I wanted to impart a ton of information to you and really try to provide some value. I am available for if you have any other questions or you'd like to see, you know, specifically how 5G could impact your organization. We're happy to talk through that with you. And otherwise, thank you very much, and I appreciate your time.